I'm Peter Levine, the director of the Defense Management Institute, and we're here today as part of a planned series of interviews with individuals who've made significant contributions to improving the management of the Department of Defense. Today, I'm speaking with the Honorable Mike Donley, who has had an exceptional career in the national security field over the last 45 years, most prominently by serving as the 22nd Secretary of the Air Force from 2008 to 2013, and as the Pentagon's Director of Administration and Management twice, from 2005 to 2008 and from 2021 to 2023. Over the years, Secretary Donley has also held key positions on Capitol Hill, on the National Security Council staff, and in various think tanks, consulting firms, and FFRDCs, including IDA, Hicks Associates, Aerospace Corporation, and McKinsey. Secretary Donley, welcome, and we're glad to have you here today.
Thanks, Peter.
Let me start where I start many of these interviews. I like to ask interviewees how they became engaged with national security issues and with the Department of Defense. Now, I understand you served in the Army and then a few years later started on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff. Can you talk about how that came about?
Well, I was drafted.
Okay, that part's easy to explain.
Yeah, easy to explain. I was one of the last draftees. But I had done 2 years of junior college before that. And then when I was in the Army, I was assigned to an intelligence unit. So I'd been to an intelligence school, a couple of schools. And in 1973, the Mideast War erupted. And in 1974, there was a Greek-Turkish confrontation over Cyprus. For both of those international incidents, my unit was put on alert for potential deployment if the need arose. And so I became more interested in how and what was going on in the world and why the U.S. military might be engaged to participate or to assist in some foreign adventure. So I decided when I went back to school, it had always been my intention to do just a few years in the Army, then return to college. And I made a decision to go back and study international affairs. And I specialized in national security issues at University of Southern California. So when I finished that, I knew I would be going to Washington because that's sort of where the action is.
A few years after you started with the Senate Armed Services Committee, you moved over to the National Security Council staff, I believe. And while you were there, if I understand correctly, you played a significant role in both Goldwater-Nichols and the Packard Commission. Can you describe what your role was as a relatively young professional and how that influenced your thinking on national security matters?
Sure. Well, the review that led to Goldwater-Nichols began in the Senate Armed Services Committee in about the 1983 timeframe, roughly. Goldwater-Nichols was really a multi-year effort. So I'd already started on that when I was on the committee staff. And Goldwater-Nichols continued to grow as a project of the Senate Armed Services Committee and also the House Armed Services Committee after I left and went to the National Security Council. So because of my history with that project, I became one of the lead staffers at the NSC on the defense management organization issues that were central to Goldwater-Nichols. So I became involved in that work at the NSC.
And the Packard Commission?
As the committee's work continued to evolve on both sides, House and Senate, the Department of Defense was having difficulty coming up with a plan to engage the Congress on this subject. It was clear that it was gaining in momentum, and there were two pieces to it. One was problems in the acquisition world, which were highlighted with, I think, a case of the $600 toilet seat sort of issue that was arising as part of the Reagan buildup. Congress was concerned about the acquisition issues that were attendant to that. So acquisition issues continued to rise, and in frustration on the part of Congress. The second part was the work that the House was doing, looking at potential reorganization of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which had been laid on the table by the outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, David Jones. So he laid some issues out that needed to be addressed. The House picked up on those issues. The acquisition issues were becoming more and more pregnant on the Hill. And the debate arose at the White House on how to get the president connected to this work and how to get the department engaged with the Congress on these subjects. And at the time, Secretary Weinberger was having difficulty in his relationships with the Congress, and a decision was made to establish a commission that would address both the acquisition issues and incorporate the organizational issues that became embedded within Goldwater-Nichols. So that's how the Packard Commission was established through the NSC.
And then did you have a role there, either in standing it up or in helping to staff?
Yes, I was paired with another NSC staffer, John Douglas, who was an Air Force colonel at the time. And John worked the acquisition parts of this. I worked the management and organizational parts of this. But together we were authors of the executive order which stood up the commission, which the president signed, and the charter for the commission and all of that. So yes, I was the staffer responsible for setting up the Packard Commission.
As you look back on it, or as on the process that you went through and that you saw Congress and the administration go through there, do you have views as to what we should learn from that experience about the appropriate role of Congress in reforming the department, and what Congress can do well and what it can't do as well?
Well, there were a few notable things about Goldwater-Nichols. One was that this proposal for some restructuring in the department, in particular the increasing the role, clarifying the role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, making the chairman the principal advisor to the President, National Security Council, giving the chairman exclusive control over the Joint Staff, improving the jointness in the department by giving combatant commanders more authority over the forces assigned to them for joint training and readiness, those sorts of things. These things, in the past, the reorganization proposals had come from presidents to Congress. This one was congressionally driven largely. So it had a little bit different dynamics to it. The department was a little bit resistant to it. But I think the main takeaway for me as a younger staffer working on these issues was the importance of doing your homework, laying the groundwork appropriately with hearings, with the production of committee reports and that sort of thing, which really helped develop a consensus in the Congress, helped develop momentum for the project overall. And that's why it was a 3 or 4 year exercise. And it involved the president's authorities as commander-in-chief, so it was appropriate for the president to be tracking what was going on and to be advised by an outside commission like we created in the Packard Commission. So there were several lessons learned in there, but mainly that you can get important things done in Washington if you take the time to build the knowledge base and to develop the consensus and sort of check all the boxes using all the tools of Capitol Hill.
Was it your impression that the decision of the White House to engage rather than standing off to the side or opposing led to a better result?
I believe it did. There was some back and forth with the Congress on the timing of the legislation as it was maturing on Capitol Hill, both in the House and in the Senate. The House was faster off the blocks and produced legislation 2 or 3 years in a row that went to conference and was dropped in conference because the Senate was a little behind and was still developing its record. And then toward the end, when both the House and the Senate were coming together, the Packard Commission was completing its work. So working out the timing of all those moving parts was part of what we had to navigate as the work came to closure. But the president did take the recommendations of the Packard Commission. The president signed a letter to the Congress outlining his views on the results of the Packard Commission, what he could support and could not support. So I do think it had an impact at the very end.
A few years later, you served in Senate-confirmed position for the first time as Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, the comptroller of the Air Force. What surprised you most when you moved into the Department of Defense and started serving in a Senate-confirmed position? What did you not expect, or what was different from the type of staff positions you'd served in both in the White House and Congress before that?
Well, certainly it was my first job in the Pentagon. So I had studied the Pentagon and been part of the national security community and had done oversight of the services from a distance, obviously as a staffer on the Armed Services Committee. But this was my first job in the department. So it was getting used to the civil-military relationships was crucial. And also, I think, understanding how the department operates internally and how much of the functional activities of the department are driven by the undersecretaries of defense, who by law have statutory responsibilities over their fields across the military departments. So the regular interaction with the comptroller, the DOD comptroller, and the coordination with my fellow Army, Navy, Air Force, Army, Navy comptrollers was sort of a new part of the game for me.
If I have the timing right, you served as Air Force comptroller as the Cold War was ending, so as Congress was expecting a peace dividend and defense budgets were coming down. And when you came back a few years later as Secretary of the Air Force, you had the privilege of serving again at a time of tight budgets with sequestration budgets. And I'm wondering, in both those positions, you had to figure out how to live within tight constraints and build a budget that wouldn't necessarily meet all the needs that the service thought that should be met. Can you talk about the process by which the Air Force went about identifying what would be cut and what wouldn't be cut, and how is that a top-down process? Is that a bottom-up process? How do you figure out when you don't have enough money how you prioritize and what you do and what you don't do?
Well, certainly a collaborative process between the secretary's staff, the service secretary's staff, and the military staff. So a secretary of a service has really two staffs to draw upon, and it's the collaboration across those staffs that helps develop program options. In the first case, when I was an assistant secretary and the comptroller, we were also as you point out, the Congress was expecting a peace dividend as the wall was coming down. So a very dynamic international security environment, changing the way we looked at certain programs. The B-2 was caught up in that period as a very high profile and expensive program where Congress and the President had difficulty in negotiating how many B-2s were going to be built because of this changing international environment. And then the other major issue was the Gulf War. So we were actually planning the shrinkage of the department and all the services were planning for static or smaller budgets. At the same time, we were having to mobilize forces and sending them by the thousands to the Middle East to prepare for the Gulf, for Desert Shield and Desert Storm. So that was really quite an awkward period where there were program planning for flat budgets, but high operational tempo, additional costs that went with the war. And there were actually aircraft and capabilities that were mobilized for the war for Desert Storm, which were literally on their way to the boneyards after the war to be retired. So it was very odd time and with a lot of moving parts from a financial point of view.
Whenever we go through a budget crunch like that, like either one of those, it seems like one of the things that people look to is management efficiencies as a way to try to make ends meet. Do you have views as to the connection between the kind of management efficiencies we look at in a budget crunch and actual management reforms? Do we get productive management change out of those exercises, or do they end up just being cut drills that reduce expenditures in the short term but don't produce reforms in the long term?
Regrettably, I think they're more the latter, typically. To get reform across the department, I think it really takes extraordinary effort and drilling down within and across a function that will touch all the military departments and all the operations of the department. One that I had been involved in as an assistant secretary was the consolidation of financial management centers and the creation of DFAS, which initially I had opposed, but I think it was probably a good idea, and it ended up consolidating a lot of financial management centers into fewer but larger and more efficient centers. And DFAS, I think, has been a great success story for the department. But to do that, it takes a tremendous amount of work, and it's at the departmental level, as opposed to individual services, which are tend to be working on the more marginal changes in order to get short-term budget savings.
And so the successful, would you say the successful changes are also likely to take more time to implement and get the benefit from?
I think they do. I think they do take time. But institutionally, you have to really change direction, and that does take time at the DOD level, and it takes time inside a service as well.
Yeah. Congress has traditionally been highly resistant to proposed cuts in weapon systems, certainly, but also personnel systems, infrastructure, virtually any other major element of DOD cost. So as you had to struggle with tight budgets and maybe focus this time on when you're Secretary of the Air Force, how do you have lessons learned on how you deal with Congress in those situations and develop a workable plan that is not only in the interest of the department, but that can pass muster politically and pass Congress?
Well, the short answer is you have to maintain communication at all times and sort of above board. We did. There were several aspects to my tenure as Air Force Secretary, which were challenging. They were war years for the department, but folks can easily overlook the fact that during those periods of high operational activity in Iraq and Afghanistan together, the Army and the Marine Corps grew. The Navy and the Air Force got smaller. But the Air Force had huge support responsibilities in both theaters. And even as the Air Force was coming down and constraining its manpower, the Air Force had to develop a whole new career field for remotely piloted aircraft, the MQ-9s, MQ-1s, MQ-9s that were coming into the inventory in great numbers. And it was easier for the Congress to add MQ-1s and MQ-9s to the budget and just buy more airplanes than it was for the Air Force to actually get ahead of that by creating a new career field, establishing a new schoolhouse, and getting a pipeline of pilots in place to support that mission. So we actually grew the RPA community at a time when the Air Force was flat or shrinking, which was no small feat. So that was one aspect of the challenge. The other, as the administrations changed from President Bush to President Obama, there was a desire to again constrain defense spending, even though there were supplementals that were supporting the wartime activities. The base budget was under close scrutiny. And for a period of time, that was kept under wraps. And some of the more sensitive decisions that we made that I would have liked to have shared with Congress earlier, we were unable to do just because of the blanket of secrecy that was placed over the internal deliberations of the department. So whenever you have difficult news for Congress, it doesn't mean that you need to maintain the communication and cue in advance what's coming, and get the dialogue going on ways to address the challenges as you go forward. And this was a particular issue for me with respect to the National Guard. So we were reducing National Guard flying units. We were retiring older airplanes, and then trying to backfill Guard locations with non-flying missions or RPA missions where that had a different dynamic, both with the units and with the communities. So the RPA, just as an example, the RPA units were, for some, not viewed as flying missions. And the second challenge with that was that the RPA missions were being created and operationalized out of their community. They were flying in Iraq or Afghanistan or somewhere far away. So so the communities really felt like, in some cases, they were losing National Guard capability.
You mentioned the Guard issues. You were secretary when the National Commission on the Future of the Air Force was formed, or is that?
It was formed just as I was transitioning out.
Okay. I'm guessing though that you saw that and how it reported and how the department related to it. Was that an experience you think that how does that experience of a National Commission looking at structural issues compare to the experience that you went through earlier with the Packard Commission and Goldwater-Nichols? Do you think that the department handled it well? Were there issues there?
I think the challenge for these commissions is their ability to get stood up and to gain traction and then produce a report, typically in just a 1-year time frame, sometimes a little bit more, maybe 15 months. I do think they can be valuable as providing second opinions or outside advice. I do think the practical constraints of managing a large institution like the Air Force give you different perspectives about what's feasible and what's not feasible that are I do think they can be helpful, but they can also overlook some
Then so you're saying
major constraints.
there's a risk that the members of an independent commission like that, because they don't have the day-to-day responsibility for running the functions in the department, might miss out on some significant constraints that they should be considered.
Yeah, I do think they're often torn between taking the information on board that an institution like the Air Force provides to support their work, but not necessarily agreeing with all the Air Force perspectives about or context in which that information is provided. So there's always don't want to be captured by the Air Force or the Army or whoever they're looking at. But they need the information from them as well. I do think there's just always a little bit of distance there, and a little bit of a not full context of what it looks like from the inside.
You mentioned that you were secretary under both President Bush and President Obama. You transitioned from an administration of one party to an administration of another party.
I did.
Can you talk about what it was like managing through a transition of that kind, and was that a difficult process to go through and to keep the department on track?
Well, I would say it was helpful to keeping the department on track. My nomination and appointment as the secretary in 2008 happened at the very end of the Bush administration and was tied to sort of a crisis situation related to the nuclear missions of the Air Force. By the time I got confirmed, it was, I believe, October, and just 1 month before a national election. The surprise, or the good fortune, depending on how you look at it, was that incoming President Obama decided to retain Bob Gates as the Secretary of Defense. And I think the central part of the discussion, as opposed to, with respect to the Air Force, was Mike Donley just got confirmed, and he's just now in place. Robert Gates, have confidence in his ability to continue the work, and it would be better for the institution not to disrupt having just gotten a new secretary confirmed. So that was, I think, the basis for my being carried over from one administration to the other. There were, I think, 3 or 4 Senate confirmed officials that in the Department of Defense that were held over. It was different, however. I had to deal with an outgoing team of folks, and then work with the White House Liaison Office on the incoming team as well. So a lot of extra personnel work, of course, during that period.
Mm-hmm. You served as this Pentagon senior management official, the DA&M, 2 times, from 2005 to 2008, and again from 2021 to 2023, and again under administrations of both parties. Can you describe what the DA&M does and why it's important to the department?
Well, the Director of Administration and Management, the shorthand for that position has been the mayor of the Pentagon. So the job's responsibility involves all the administrative support for the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So that's the personnel support, the budget support for OSD, the legal support for OSD, and all of that closely tied to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who kind of oversees the OSD operations. So you develop a very close relationship with the Deputy Secretary. But you also have Pentagon responsibilities. So you have OSD responsibilities, but you also have Pentagon responsibilities. The DA&M is the Secretary's agent for the Pentagon. The Pentagon is, I think, the only DOD installation that is not operated by a defense agency or a military service. It's owned by the Secretary of Defense, and the DA&M operates the Pentagon. So all of the maintenance, the construction, the manning of the Pentagon support workforce is in Washington Headquarters Services and the Pentagon Force Protection Agency. The first time I had the position, it was in the process of some growth and also some getting back on track. The main features, there were several features of my first time in that position. One is that the longtime director of administration, Doc Cook, had died unexpectedly. He died from injuries resulting from a car accident. That took a little bit of time, and then there was an interim leader, and then I was placed in that position. The main thing going on at that time was the renovation of the Pentagon, which was a huge decade-long operation, and my role was to keep the renovation moving forward on schedule and on budget. But it was a major feature of daily life at the Pentagon. That basically 1/5 of the Pentagon was under construction while the department kept operating and everybody was working in there. So that was certainly a main feature of the first time through.
When you came back the second time, you had some additional responsibilities because with the disestablishment of the chief management officer, some of those duties fell to you. Can you talk about the additional duties, and is that too much for one person to have both of those positions at the same time?
Yeah. So as you point out, the DA&M had considerable responsibilities already. The issue of what to do with the chief management officer responsibilities once the position was disestablished by Congress was the focus of my second time starting in 2021. There are a lot of duties that go with that. I didn't feel like they were very well established when I got in place, so I think they take time to develop. So developing this capacity to perform the duties of the performance improvement officer of the department just take time. I think part of the decisions on putting it with the DA&M had to do with making sure that we had an official that would be closely tied to the Secretary and Deputy Secretary of Defense. Of course, the DA&M is one of many direct reports to the Secretary and the Deputy, but I do think there's a special trusted relationship with the DA&M because of the scope and depth of interaction that takes place on a regular basis, especially with the Deputy Secretary in the operation of the department. A second consideration was that the overall management of the Secretary's office and the management of the department need to be tied to an organization that has enduring connections to that office. Another alternative was to assign these duties to the comptroller. But to the extent that management and reform issues have had difficulty in the department gaining traction because when the term reform is raised, everybody hangs on to their wallet. It's viewed as somebody's coming after my money. So we tried to change that dynamic, but the fear that we were trying to avoid was having management and reform attached only to the comptroller's office. Because the comptroller would would be able to absorb this function as well. But I think the association of reform and budget cutting was something that we did not want to perpetuate. We wanted to change that dynamic.
One of the issues that the chief management officer and the deputy chief management officer always faced was their relationship to the various pillars of the department. So as the DOD chief management officer or deputy chief management officer, to what extent did you get into what the services were doing, and to what extent were the services willing to, or the military departments willing to listen to you? And the same thing, frankly, with regard to the undersecretary. So if you were interested in reforming acquisition issues or personnel issues, there was an undersecretary for that. And so the question always was front and center with the CMO and DCMO. Where is your realm? Where can you operate, and and how do you relate to people who own those systems and own those processes?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a difficult one because the DA&M does not have the stature of an undersecretary of defense. Even if that individual did have a role as undersecretary of defense, a title, he or she would not have any more authority than any other an undersecretary of defense across the full scope of the staff. So your point is well taken. I personally didn't get into much of that during my period. So I spent many months getting the decisions made about where to put the function, and tried to strengthen the staffing and that goes with that. Once the Congress had indicated its intention to disestablish the CMO internally to the department before I even arrived, there was a great deal of impacts on the staff. Many people left. Some of the resources that were associated with the CMO position had already been withdrawn by the comptroller community. So I had a lot of internal rebuilding. So getting it assigned, getting the decisions made, where to assign it, building up the staff, and then putting in the mechanisms that would capture the responsibilities of the PIO and put them on an annual cycle of activity. The establishment of governance for that, the creation, at the time it was called the Defense Business Council, the reestablishment of a Defense Business Council. Those were the things that I focused on for my second 2 years.
Was the strategic management plan a part of that?
Yes, it was. And the strategic management plan was, I think we went through 2 versions during my time there. The focus of our work there was to make sure the strategic management plan was tied to the National Defense Strategy. May sound like a natural, needed connection, but bureaucratically making that linkage proved to be very difficult, and I think it's still a challenge for the department. But it is a necessary link that needs to be made explicitly and carried forward.
As DA&M, you were also responsible for standing up the Defense Management Institute, for which we're obviously very thankful. I wonder if you can talk about your vision for the Defense Management Institute and what you hoped it would be able to achieve, or how you hoped it would be able to contribute to it.
Yeah. Well, I'm very glad we were able to create the DMI during my tenure. It had great support from Deputy Secretary Hicks in putting this together. The main driver behind the Defense Management Institute was really it was a product of many years of observing that the management and organization of the department, the reform-related issues attendant to the department, really worked up and down over decades. You know, you'd get a push in one area, in a personnel area, a push in an acquisition area, And sometimes the changes would be made, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would slide, or they would not get recommendations would not be implemented. Administrations change, congressional interests change. The idea behind the Defense Management Institute was that Congress and the department would have some place to go to tell them and to remind them of what the record was previously on any major reform initiative, whether it be in the medical area or in the personnel management area or financial acquisition. All of these issues have records and have history behind them. We need a place to go to get the real story on what happened in those reforms, what succeeded, what didn't succeed, and how we can learn from them to get better results going forward, and to study issues in advance before we come up with ideas for immediate signature and implementation.
You have a long history with defense management issues going back. I added it up, I think, over 7 administrations now. You've got as much of a perspective on this, I would think, as anybody. And I have sort of a philosophical question I'd like to ask you. Is defense management reform something where we're progressing toward an objective, or is defense management something that every administration and everybody and sort of every new team has to fight a battle to keep management as strong and successful? Or do we win battles, or is it a perpetual fight that we just have to keep fighting battles?
Well, I do think it's a perpetual challenge. I do think it's the department is one of the largest agencies in the federal government, of course, but it's as we've exchanged before, it's about 3% of GDP. It's about 12% of federal outlays. It's a if you step back and look at it, it's actually easier to look at DOD as a country, because annual expenditures are equal to about the 20th largest economy in the world. And just in terms of acreage and square miles, sort of to get a sense for the global footprint of the department, it's about the size of Greece. And if you think about the governance that goes with a country that has the 20th largest economy, the leadership comes in. If you think of a prime minister or a parliament or a cabinet that runs something that large, there are reforms and issues at play in every corner of the department. Again, issues that have their own history, that are on the ups or on the downs, are somehow moving forward. The leadership has to pick just one or two areas to focus on, and they don't always get to pick those issues. Sometimes the wall falls, or Russia crosses a border, into Ukraine, and or there's a Gulf War, or there are terrorist attacks. I guess the point is that leaders don't always get to pick the issues that they focus on, and they tend to pick on and focus on the issues that are most important from a national security, a global security perspective, and make sure that the department is operating internally in ways that support those national and international objectives. So the internal management of the department is always a challenge, and it's a perpetual effort to keep things moving in the right direction. And perspectives change on what the right direction is, and how quickly we can go there.
if I have this right, I believe you served in the department under 4 different secretaries of defense: Cheney, Gates, Panetta, and Austin. And I believe 5 deputies: Atwood, England, Lynn, Carter, and Hicks. There may be some others because I have trouble keeping track over those years. But I wonder, that's a pretty impressive list of leaders you served under. Do you have thoughts as to what kinds of qualities make for a successful and effective Secretary of Defense?
Well, I think those that have had previous experience at the national level tend to do a little bit better. I felt like, Secretary Gates, for example, was at the top of the intelligence part of the national security community at one time. He had NSC experience. He did not have DOD experience, and there were a lot of things about the department he did not understand. But I thought he was a very effective leader. His management style, as you might imagine from the intelligence community, was to hold things a little closer to the vest. So it took a while to sort of get used to that and understand how that operated. But Secretary Panetta, who came in behind him, was a very different personality. Even though he had come from being director of the CIA, he had been a White House chief of staff a long period of time in Congress and OMB as well. So he was very experienced across government, very comfortable in his own suit, obviously. But he, compared to Secretary Gates, he immediately sort of opened up the communications. And the DOD leadership had more interaction with the president, I think, during Secretary Panetta's time than we did with Secretary Gates. Secretary Rumsfeld was obviously doing it for the second time. He was very confident and had his own confidence in his personality and his style, and doing it for the second time, I think, especially. But even after 9/11, he was a pretty effective leader as well.
Now, deputy secretaries typically serve a different type of role from the secretaries.
Yeah.
Are there different qualities that you see in a deputy secretary from a secretary that make them effective?
Yes, I do think it typically, although not exclusively, but typically it's the role of the secretary to do the up and out work with the White House, with the Congress, and especially with international partners. This is a long trend, but you can see how hard Secretary Austin is working with international allies and partners. This is literally full-time work for the secretary. So the deputy tends to be oriented toward the internal work of the department. And deputies come with different backgrounds. So we've had some that have come from the comptroller background, because the comptroller has a very strong sense for the internal operations of the department, managing the money and dealing with Congress, dealing with OMB. But I do think it helps. I do think the service secretary's role brings an important perspective, because the service secretaries are the places in the department where all of the activities, the functional activities that are represented by the undersecretaries of defense, the comptroller function, the personnel function, acquisition, and others, where all of that comes together. And so the services are the ones that have to make the trade-offs and to balance all of the capabilities of the department within their areas of responsibility. The undersecretaries are focused more on their vertical slice, if you will. The service secretaries have an opportunity to see how that gets integrated and what the trade-offs are. Of course, it's the responsibility of the secretary and the deputy to make final decisions and to shape the department as they see best. But I do think the service perspectives are important in that context. So I think deputy secretaries of defense that are open in their aperture in terms of taking inputs from across the department. I think those are important qualities that go with that function. The deputy secretary plays a tremendous role in the governance of the department, which is big and complex. So committee meetings are involved dozens of people, and I have a lot of respect for the roles of the deputy secretary. It's one of the toughest jobs in Washington, hands down.
If you are looking forward to people who are entering senior management positions in the department today, young people who are hoping to enter senior management positions who aspire to a career like yours, what kind of advice would you give?
Well, first of all, I remind folks that the progress in my career from one position to another, from a joint job, it's largely by chance. There aren't a lot of things in there that are predictable or certain, and there's a lot of serendipity, a lot of timing, a lot of accidents to why things happen or don't happen as they do. I often remind folks that you can look at my background or resume and see the progression, but you don't know how many jobs that I didn't get or along the way, or mistakes that were made. But my personal background has been more as a generalist in the national security area, and I have found that to be very helpful. I would say it worked for me, but I was in jobs where I could learn and where I had a broad view of the world. I felt like on the Armed Services Committee, being responsible for the operation and maintenance parts of the defense budget was helpful, because operation and maintenance covers a broad spectrum of activity. It touches the acquisition world because of the depots and the readiness, the material readiness of the force and of the fleets. But it also pays for the civilian manpower, so you get a sense for the personnel side of the department. And then you also get a sense for the mix of all the different functions and missions. So O&M, I felt, was it was a very broad swath of responsibilities, and I was able to learn a lot in that position. I came in with more of a policy bent from my academic background, but then quickly got into the budget issues, the manpower issues. So I was, I guess, getting exposure to a broadest swath of the department as early as you can is a good thing. I also think as my career progressed, and there are a couple of other aspects that I felt I learned from that I do think are very important to people coming up in the community. One is jointness. Certainly Goldwater-Nichols was, deeply focused and aimed at improving the jointness of the work. in the department, and then the interagency piece, and then the allied piece. So at every level, national security is a team sport, and it is extremely challenging to pull together all the pieces in the departmental level, at the NSC or interagency level, to get the government working together, and then to get partners and allies working together. There's a tremendous amount of work that's involved in building the coalitions, holding them together, and making them effective in operations to get the national security effect you want. So getting outside of a narrow perspective, getting broad perspectives early, and getting that joint interagency and coalition perspective.
Did you have mentors early in your career who helped you navigate the territory and understand how the Pentagon worked, or how the political system worked, that helped you find your way?
Clearly, I would say being on the Armed Services Committee was great. I started working for a senator who was on the Armed Services Committee, so I supported his office. He was from Iowa, Senator Roger Jepson. Not a lot of military in Iowa, but he was on the Armed Services Committee. So he was on the personnel subcommittee. So I learned personnel issues, but I was around the committee. And I was recruited by the committee staff to come to the Armed Services Committee. Ron Lehman, who later became an Assistant Secretary of Defense and an ambassador working on arms control issues, was influential there. I owe a lot to Ron. Bud McFarland was on the Armed Services Committee at the time. Between he and Ron, they're the ones that sort of recruited me from the Armed Services Committee to the National Security Council. So, and there were others, but I think moving from a sort of a junior staff to a senior staff role, you have supervisors and mentors who are helping shape your career and your development, and I owe as much as anybody to those who helped along the way.
Well, Mike, this has been a great discussion. I really appreciate your time. Are there any final words you'd like to leave with?
No, it's been a privilege to work in this community and to do this work. And the commitment of all the military and civilian folks who are in this community to our nation's security was always inspiring to me, and helped propel me forward day to day. So it's time to pass that on to the next generation and let them do it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter.